We're going to read chapter 11, and like I said in a class meeting this morning, this chapter takes place in the courtroom. So this is when Sylvia's dad is actually in court suing the not just one school district, but multiple school districts now. And the superintendent and other people are presenting the reasons why they think it's okay that they're segregating the schools. It's a really long chapter, so I'm going to summarize some parts of it. And like we talked about this morning in our class meeting, it goes through a lot of really awful things because, as we know, this is racial segregation that we're talking about in our history. And the policy was inherently racist. And so they're explaining why they have the beliefs that they do, but it's hard to listen to them talk about because it's horrendous. Chapter 11. Talking about bulls is not the same thing as facing them in the ring. So that means talking about something is not the same as actually taking on the challenge. You can talk about what you would do, but actually doing it can be a lot harder. Sylvia, Los Angeles, California. When I first read that, I noticed that she was no longer in Westminster, and I thought maybe Aki had come back. But then I read ahead and found out, no, she's just in court. Sylvia stood as Judge Paul J. McCormick entered the courtroom. She felt like she was in the principal's office and someone was going to be in a lot of trouble. The judge wore a long black robe like the graduation gowns she had seen in the newspaper. Someday I will wear a gown just like that, Sylvia thought. Please be seated, the judge said. Sylvia sat down, carefully tucking her dress under her to avoid wrinkles. She wore her favorite church dress, red and black plaid with a built-in petticoat, and her black patent leather shoes. Even though they pinched her toes, she wanted to look her best and make her father proud. I was thinking about that a lot. Earlier we read about Aki wearing her nicest clothes when she went to the internment camp, and when we read the ledger book of Thomas Blue Eagle, that also came up, right? The kids all put on their best clothes when they went away to the Carlisle school. And it seems like there's this theme of people putting on their best clothing to go and do something challenging or hard or scary. And I'm wondering if maybe it gives them more courage or confidence because they feel like, okay, I'm all put together, I'm prepared. Sylvia noticed the court reporter, a young woman who sat up very straight and made her fingers fly across a strange keyboard device, typing out every word that was said. When there was a pause, her fingers rested. When someone spoke, her fingers came alive. How can she stay focused without letting her mind wander even for a minute? Sylvia thought about the secretary in the Westminster office, the one who had sent her away almost 3 years ago. That's where all of this started. She thought, I wish Aunt Soledad didn't live so far away so that she could be here to see where that day has brought us. At first, Sylvia's father's attorney, Mr. Marcus, and the lawyer for the school system, took turns asking each other questions. Sylvia's father sat near them at the front of the room, occasionally speaking quietly to his lawyer. After what seemed like hours, no witnesses had been called yet to testify. Testify means to stand up in front and speak. And speak the truth. Sylvia whispered to her mother, What's happening? Her mother cupped her hand around Sylvia's ear and whispered back. The lawyers agreed that all the schools acted the same way. Instead of listening to all 5 school districts, they will hear only from one. Otherwise, this case would last 5 times longer. Sylvia nodded. I couldn't stand that. Finally, a witness was called, James L. Kent, superintendent of schools in the Garden Grove School District, which was one of the 5 districts in Orange County. Hoover School was in that district. Mr. Marcus said, Who decides which school the children will attend? The Board of Trustees tells me to take charge of that part, Mr. Kent said. Now, is it a fact, sir, that the school board policy is that children of Mexican parentage shall attend Hoover School? No, sir, Mr. Kent interrupted. Between the 1st and 6th grades, Mr. Marcus finished. So we already know that he's not being completely honest, right? Because we know that Sylvia and her brothers got sent to Hoover School just because their last name was a Spanish last name. No, Mr. Kent said. However, the policy does read that for Spanish-speaking students, and students who need help, we have set up Hoover School. What do you mean by Spanish-speaking students? Asked Mr. Marcus. Those children who come to school with a language handicap. So he's saying that because they speak Spanish, they're at a disadvantage. But he's not acknowledging that they actually speak 2 languages. That applies just to Mexican children, doesn't it? Mr. Marcus asked. Yes, so far, Mr. Kent said. And so what they're establishing, what they're proving is that their policy is racist because it's not for everybody who is struggling with language. They're applying it to one group of people. Jerome swung his feet back and forth, kicking the edge of his chair. Bang, bang, bang. Sylvia's mother put her hand on his knee, and he stilled. Do you give the children any language test before you send them over there, or do you just choose? Mr. Marcus asked. We give them a test by talking to them. I want you to think back. Do you remember when Sylvia was first in that waiting room with the secretary? Did anyone give her a language test? Mm-mm. So he's lying. Who gives the test? Either the principal or myself, Mr. Kent replied. That is not true. No one ever spoke to me. Seething, that means really angry and like kind of spilling out with anger. Sylvia muttered, no, under her breath. She felt a tap on her wrist and looked up at her mother, whose eyes said, I know, but be quiet. The lawyers discussed how it wasn't against the law to separate kids into different schools so long as the schools were equal. Ask yourself this right now. Are the schools equal in this book? Right? Hoover School and Westminster School, did they offer the same things? Sylvia wanted to laugh. No one would consider Hoover School and Westminster School to be equal. If the schools were equal, then parents would send their kids to both schools. Sylvia knew that white parents would never send their kids to Hoover. The lawyer for the school system told the judge that having separate schools was good for the children because it allowed some children to take part in Americanization instruction to learn American values and customs. Americanization? Doesn't that mean to make someone who isn't American into an American? Sylvia wanted to point out that she was as American as he was. She wanted to tell him that she had spoken English her entire life, that she could speak 2 languages, English and Spanish, not just one. Lots of kids at Hoover School speak fluent English, Sylvia thought. This lawyer doesn't know what he's talking about. Sylvia looked over at her father. How can he be so calm? If he can do it, I'll do it too. I guess what I'm wondering as I'm reading this and listening to Sylvia's reaction or her thoughts, I'm trying to decide, does the lawyer actually not know what he's talking about, or is the lawyer just lying and being dishonest? Are you saying that all 292 pupils who attended Hoover School last semester had language difficulty? Mr. Marcus asked the superintendent. No, Mr. Kent replied. But you still kept them in Hoover School, is that correct? Yes. I'm going to fast forward through some of the legal arguments here, but basically what the lawyer starts talking about is, and the superintendent, starts talking about, is that he thinks that they still need to have 2 separate schools, even if it's not language difficulty, because the children at Hoover School need to learn things like manners and how to get along with other people, and that the kids at Westminster School don't need to learn how to do that. How could he say that about someone? About me? Does he actually believe that? Sylvia's mother shifted in her chair and breathed deeply in and out through her nose. Sylvia thought her mother wanted to stand up and yell at him as much as she did. I think so too. I think her mother's taking deep breaths to keep herself calm. Judge McCormick frowned. Sylvia liked that about him. He didn't seem to care for what the superintendent was saying either. You find that all of the children at Hoover School require this extra assistance? Mr. Marcus asked. Yes, Mr. Kent replied. You mean that without any testing of any kind, you can determine that an entire group of children needs help? Oh no, said Mr. Kent, we give tests. What kind of tests do you give to the children to determine if they require Americanization? We have a talk with the parent and with the child to see what their attitudes are. and whether or not they're adapted to going to school, Mr. Kent said. And if the child meets those criteria, Mr. Marcus said, that would make a difference. Sylvia sat up straight. They were talking about her and other kids like her. Yes, it would make a difference, Mr. Kent said. Do you currently allow any Mexican students to go to Westminster? No, sir, said Mr. Kent. Sylvia shrank down in her seat. And we get through more court arguments. Sylvia is wondering how this guy can stand there and swear on the Bible and lie. And then they get to the part where they're asking the superintendent if he believes that one group of people is better than another group of people, and he says that he does not. But then he talks about how he thinks that they still need to have two separate kids because the kids have different economic outlook and clothing. And that some students are superior to other students, and that's why they need to be segregated and have different schools. And that is one of the reasons why they are being segregated? Yes. That is all, Mr. Marcus said, dismissing the witness. Sylvia wanted to go home. She didn't want to return to Hoover School. She didn't want to go to Westminster School. She just wanted to go home, climb into bed, and hide from the world. And that is the end of chapter 11. And I know I skipped through some of the legal arguments, but it was all the superintendent sitting there explaining why he thought it was okay that they were segregating the schools. And we know that this is a true story and a real court case that happened. So these were real beliefs that he was sharing at the time. And Sylvia had to sit there and listen to him in the courtroom say things about her and her family that she knew were not true, but that were really horrible to hear. So when you're done with this chapter, go ahead and go to the Google form and record your question or your thought or your comment, and we will read again tomorrow to find out what happens with the court case. Obviously, it's against the law to segregate schools at this point, currently in our history. So we're reading about a time when it was not yet, it was beginning to be illegal, but they were still sorting the things out in court about how that looked.